Hello, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode in our ongoing analysis of American literature and its history. Just a quick recap of what we have talked about so far. In the first part of these lectures, we started talking about American history and literature from its beginning years up until 1820. And then after that, we started talking about one of the most consequential periods in the history of American literature between 1820 and 1865. A lot of critics believe that it was in this period that American writers and cultural activists actually shaped the future of American literature and, of course, culture as well. Having talked about this, we moved on to the third period, quickly following the American Civil War, 1865 to 1914, the beginning of the First World War, and of course the literary and cultural movement, which came to be known as Modernism. And we talked about so many different authors as well. And today we begin our journey into the next period in the history of American literature by talking about American culture and literature between the two world wars. So we start with the First World War, its impact on American culture and literature, and then we move on to what happened in the Second World War and the kind of impact that it had on the United States in general, as well as the literature produced in this period. So without further ado, let's just dive in and start our analysis. So let's just go back a few years to the end of this American Civil War in 1865. America started rebuilding itself, right? And so between the American Civil War, the end of the Civil War in 1865, and 1917, which is when the US joined World War I. So the US didn't initially take part in the First World War in 1914 and waited a couple of years before joining the war. So between these two periods, 1865 and 1917, which again, as I said, is when the US joined the First World War, the country's industrial power had grown immensely. Now we had a transcontinental railroad system which connected all parts of the country to the neighbors in the north, the neighbors in the south. We had good railroad systems that connected farms, small towns, industrial cities, and urban centers as well. Another important development, which we will talk about later, was Henry Ford's company, which turned cars from a luxury item, which was owned by only a select few uh, rich people, into a consumer good, which could be bought by like everyone. So this was also an important development in this period. And we also had the successful efforts of the Wright brothers to fly the first plane, and therefore there were a lot of aviation companies which tried to follow in their footsteps and create planes so that people could move between different places more easily and conveniently. So all of these changes had happened in the period between 1865 and 1917. However, by the end of the First World War, the United States was still uh, kind of a rural country. What I mean is that it was still a nation of small farms and small towns. A lot of the population was still living in rural districts and towns rather than, for example, big urban centers. And that's why America was not really considered to be this kind of modern industrial power, even though the industry had grown immensely. In terms of the population of the United States, the majority of Americans were still of English descent or German descent or ancestry, and 1 in every 10 American was from African descent. So this is how the United States was at the beginning and the end of the First World War. Now, when the United States participated in the First World War, well, there was a lot of buzz going about international policies. Now, the United States needed to be an international superpower, right? It had to be able to exert its power overseas as well. But there was a lot of dissatisfaction back home about these international policies that the government was pursuing at the time. And so many of the people actually wanted to wind the clock back to pre-war modes of life, to the simpler modes of life which was common before the First World War. And one of those issues was that, well, after the First World War, there were a lot of immigrants again pouring into the United States. And the United States had no problem with this because it wanted to present itself as this kind of cultural melting pot. And so it needed those workforce, those workers and laborers from overseas to come in. But after the war, because of this dissatisfaction with, the sort of like the shape of the country changing so much suddenly, people were kind of afraid. And that's why in 1924, we had the Immigration Exclusion Act, which banned immigrants from Asia. They defined quotas for immigrants from other countries based on the number of existing people in the United States from those countries. So they were kind of afraid that this international policy of creating a multicultural country was going to remove what was American about America. So the true American nature of America. And that's why they kind of did this in order to prevent further removal of American values from life. Another thing that happened after the First World War in America was what is generally known as the Red Scare. There was a lot of suspicion going on in this period, sort of something like the witch trials, which we talked about previously, that a lot of people were suddenly becoming communists. And the United States sort of believed in capitalism and the way that it attacks communism. And so those people who were believed to be supporters of communism were deported, were persecuted, and prosecuted even. And so there was this kind of Red Scare. People were afraid of, um, expressing their opinions about communism, etc. And so a lot of laborers and immigrants who had come to America in search of a better life were now being deported because they were being accused of having allegiances with the communist Soviet Union. However, not everything was gloomy and dark. There were positive developments too. Finally, in this period, we have the passage of the voting rights for women into the U.S. Constitution in the form of the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment incorporated the suffrage, the voting rights for women, into the U.S. It added it to the U.S. Constitution. And the reason for this was that, well, women played such an important role in the American society during the First World War because they needed more people, more workers, and so women could serve in the army as nurses, as ambulance drivers. And so when women became mobilized in this period, they took up a very, very active role in this period. It was only natural for them to seek more rights, to advocate for more freedom and more rights, and that's why finally in 1920 the voting rights was given to women. We also have the establishment in 1909, of course, of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, which encouraged more assimilation of black folk into the American society. And one example in particular is important is that NAACP encouraged the US Army to recruit black officers into the army, which they had never done before. And so this was for the first time that black officers could also serve in the army. So there were all of these positive developments happening. But this was not all. There were other changes as well. So the United States was step by step was moving away from that rural state, which I told you a few minutes ago, and it was trying to become a modern nation. Many Americans, for example, wanted to taste the expatriate lifestyle and living abroad, so they moved abroad and they remained there until the end of their lives. Some even, renounced their American citizenship and became the citizens of other countries, in particular T.S. Eliot, who gave up his American passport or citizenship and became a British citizen. African Americans moved away from the segregated South and were employed in northern, for example, factories. Young people tried to attend college away from home, so sort of experiencing this kind of independence. And the government was really interested in removing inequality in America. They were looking for successful models all over the globe. And interestingly enough, secretly, they were even looking at communist societies to see if they could find a model for, combating inequality in the United States. So all of these positive changes were happening in the United States after the First World War until we get to 1929, in which a defining event happened, and that's when the stock market crashed. So in 1929, the stock market crashes. The economy in the United States goes into a huge depression, what is generally known as the Great Depression, as you can see here. There's a 25% unemployment rate, and this is no joke. Just keep in mind that most women were still not allowed to work. So if we add the number of women who were unemployed, who were not allowed to work before the Great Depression, and therefore could not be counted as data, as a part of these statistics, the number was even more staggering by today's standards. And so there was this unemployment going on. People lost their homes, lost their jobs. We will talk about the Great Depression later, but just I want you to just think about all of this that happened. So this is just a very quick review of what happened between the First World War and the end of the Second World War. The Great Depression continued, everyone, until the First World War, when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, and then Germany declared war. And that's when the all hell broke loose and the Second World War began, which of course again had some positive and negative impacts as well. Obviously, war is devastating. Nobody wants to be in a war. But the US economy kind of was influenced in a positive way because World War II mobilized the economy. Now, all of the different sectors of the US economy put their efforts into producing what was needed for American soldiers, for their own country in time of war. And so all of the industries were revitalized. And as I told you, just like what happened in the First World War, because there was a shortage of workers, women also joined the workforce. So there were new opportunities for women to join the workforce and become independent workers. Now, the Second World War ended in August of 1945 when two atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so Japan was in ruins, the whole Europe was in ruins. And because the United States was far away from all of this, the United States successfully emerged as the world's major industrial and political power. And finally, after these two wars, the United States became a fully modern nation, moving away from that rural kind of vibe that it had to a more modern nation. And of course, the period between these two wars in culture and literature is what we call modernism. And so this is what we are going to talk about later. So let's talk about modernism for a while. So modernism was not specific to America, even though we are talking about the history of American literature, but it was an international phenomenon. It was a wave of challenges mounted against traditional authority in almost every aspect of life imaginable, in art, in religion, science, politics, society, everywhere. There were lots of struggles and lots of debates about how we can make it new, as Ezra Pound used to say. So everything had to be renovated somehow. And there was a lot of disagreement between writers and thinkers and philosophers, etc., even like ordinary people. Some writers and philosophers rejoiced the arrival of the modern age. Others lamented the loss of the previous age. Some anticipated future utopias based on the technological advances that they were seeing. Others believed that we could see nothing but dystopias in the future. But everyone agreed that we have to make everything new. We have to create something entirely new. So this is what they unanimously agreed on. There were also like three important debates happening in this period, among the intellectuals and the thinkers and the theoreticians. So we're going to talk about them one by one, okay? The first issue, which created a lot of debate, was the issue of using a literary tradition. In other words, how much allegiance should we have to the previous works of literature produced in the previous ages? Should we adhere to their rules and customs and traditions, or should we completely disagree with all of them, oppose all of them, and create something from the scratch? So for some people, any kind of work which registered allegiance to literary history, it could be just a simple allusion to another work in the past, or by using a traditional poetic form, for example. Any kind of work which imitated, referenced, or used anything traditional was immediately labeled as imitative, second rate, and of course, old fashioned. Others believe that this is like ludicrous and we cannot really talk about literature like this. And so they believe that if your work fails to honor literary tradition, then your writing is incompetent, or just you're a bad writer, just to put it simply. So for other people, following tradition was a value, not renouncing it. There were others as well who believed that, okay, well, neither one of this works. So we don't have just two options, they argued. So they said that, yeah, you're saying that you can either plead allegiance to something, or you can completely renounce it. But I'm going to talk about, so I'm not going to, so either you use literary tradition or you don't use it. But there was a third group whose proponents favored the use of literary tradition, but in an oppositional way. So the first group said that we don't want to use anything old-fashioned. We don't even want to use it. The second group said that we completely want to use it, like fully utilize it. There was a third group who said that, yeah, I'm going to use literary tradition, all those previous forms, but I'm going to do it oppositionally. I'm going to, allude to them, but in an ironic way, in a derogatory way, in an oppositional way. So there was this third group of people as well who weighed in on this first debate, the use of literary tradition. The second important debate which occurred in this period was about the role and the place of pop culture in serious literature. Do we consider pop culture as a kind of serious literature, or do we just completely ignore it and just consider it as just, cheap kind of literature, as escapist, so to speak. And so throughout this era, pop culture, whether they liked it or not, pop culture gained momentum. A lot of people liked it. In fact, a lot of people did not really care for the high, quote unquote, high modernist works of literature which were being produced. A lot of like ordinary people just wanted, ordinary kinds of literature. So pop culture gained momentum and influence in this period. So some writers regarded it as, something to be embraced. It's okay to embrace pop culture. It's okay to occasionally use it, even in your own writing. But to other people, this was blasphemy. This was like insulting God, right? And so they said that serious literature, by definition, opposes any kind of commercialism or pop culture. So we can never reconcile these two sides. So they completely wanted to remove it. The third debate, which was very popular in this period, was about the question of how far literature should engage itself in political and social issues of the day. You know, in the previous ages, didactic literature was something quite accepted, even though, yeah, a lot of people try to write just for aesthetically, so to speak, without really having a political message or a social message. But, the 20th century saw a lot of changes in society, a lot of power shifts, for example. In the Soviet Union, we have communism on the one hand, we have capitalism on the other hand. There were a lot of social changes happening. And so a lot of people were really interested in, engaging in this kind of debate, like how far should literature engage itself with or in political and social struggle? Should art be something autonomous and independent and just, work aesthetically to present people with a kind of transcendent truth, and so that people can understand it without even like thinking about the society or the political systems around them. So for some people, um, you know, including political or social agendas in literature was something completely acceptable. And for some people, it was just synonymous with propaganda, which they hated. And so they said that like there is no place. But there were other people as well who argued that there should be a balance between a work's aesthetic part as well as a work's message. And so there was again this kind of debate between all of the intellectuals of the day. But all in all, as we said, and as this last debate showed, a lot of things were changing, not only in the United States, but also all over Europe. And so the title of the next part of the presentation is Changing Times, because a lot was changing. First, let's talk about the 1920s, and then after that, we will talk about the 1930s. So a lot was changing in the 1920s. Let me just talk about some of them very quickly. A lot of people were suddenly interested in pursuing academic debates or general debates about um, self-expression of individuals, the self-realization of individuals. Like how much are we allowed to, now that everything is changing, how much are we allowed to express ourselves differently from what the society expects us? Just keep in mind that in the previous ages, religious movements, the Puritans, etc., had control over like how much individuals could express themselves. And so with modernism, with a lot of distrust in the role of religion, etc., uh, people were starting to to think about like, can we express ourselves differently now or not? So this idea turned into, again, discussion of individual versus society. As an individual, how much freedom should I be given so that I can feel comfortable expressing who I am freely? And then how much should I care about the society at large? So this kind of debate between individuals and society was also really, really interesting. And another important thing which was changing in the period was the sexual mores Mores is, I'm sorry if you know the definition, but for those of you who might not know the definition, mores means customs and traditions. So the customs and traditions of society related to sexuality also changed completely. So a lot of people were now identifying as being like homosexuals. Like for the first time, the term homosexuality, in fact, came into widespread use in this period. There was also a lot of ideas by psychologists and psychoanalysts. We know that Sigmund Freud kind of created psychoanalysis, and then his ideas were completely revolutionary in this time. And like before the modern period, we thought of our own psyche, of our mind, as a unified whole, and that's why we believe the human beings to be the center of the universe and the most important element of the universe. But Freud's ideas challenged this perception of the mind as a unified whole. Because while Freud, on the one hand, argued that no, our mind is not unified, it has a conscious part, it has an unconscious part, a subconscious one as well. And so we also have our brain, it consists of like different kinds of uh, forces which are always fighting each other. The id, which works by the pleasure principle, wants to have fun all the time. The superego, which is this angelic side of us that prevents us from having fun, and then the ego, which works on the reality principle and wants to sort of connect everything to the real world and talk about the consequences, etc. And so Freud was saying that there is always a struggle going on in our mind, and so we cannot really define a person as a unified whole, because at any given moment, one part of his brain might be like steering the role, might have gotten hold of the steering wheel, so to speak. And so Freud's ideas of the unconscious, that most of our childhood experiences are actually not forgotten completely, but they are repressed in our unconscious mind, that they create some kind of repressed desires in us. And later on, when we grow up, our behaviors, different kinds of behavior, are influenced by our repressed memories of childhood. They completely change the scene for the way people were thinking about sexuality and identity. Another important thing which happened in this period was, of course, women. They demanded more freedom, be it in the realm of education or professional work, mobility, or even in terms of the dresses that they could wear. And so dresses became more casual for women, and they demanded kind of more freedom in these areas. Another important change which happened in this period was, of course, African Americans. African Americans, just like women who gained more freedoms and more mobility, became mobile in these years as never before. Um, as we said, around 1915, there was a lot of opportunity for African Americans in the North, because there were a lot of factories in the North. And so there was a second like great migration. Like the first migration was from Africa to the United States to America back when, and then the second great migration kind of happened when groups of African Americans moved away from the South, and they went to the North to be employed in those factories in the industrial North. And this immigration was actually very, very important because, well, on the one hand, it revealed a lie, a very important lie that the Southerners always claimed to be true. And they were always claiming that, hey, blacks are comfortable here in the South. They actually like our segregated policies. They actually like to be living in a segregated place, that to be like, away from the white population. So it revealed this lie that it was absolutely false, that African Americans were very comfortable with, working in mixed, for example, cities. But also it was important for us because as the African Americans were migrating away from the South suddenly saw that its workforce was diminishing and it was losing power in terms of its economy and industry. And so they realized the importance of the African American population. So this was also another important development that occurred in this period. I'm sorry, I apologize. And so, as I said, African Americans became more visible in this period. And so, something interesting happened in this period. Now, there was a part of New York City called Harlem. It had a population, a completely black population of over 150,000 people. A lot of people described it as a city within a city. In this city within a city, African American writers wrote for themselves, they performed, the artists performed, musicians composed, painters painted for themselves. So there was this kind of vitality in this part of New York. And so they also founded journals for themselves, The Crisis in 1910, An Opportunity in 1923. And this cultural production, this nonstop cultural production of African American artists in a place which was completely, had black populations, came to be known as the Harlem Renaissance, which is one of the most important cultural developments of the 20th century. But there was something interesting going on as well. Like Du Bois, uh, whom we have talked about before, published a book called The Souls of the Black Folk. And in that book, he talks about a very interesting concept, which a lot of scholars even use today, the idea of double consciousness. Let me explain what double consciousness is by talking about another example. Uh, think about some immigrant family, okay, who has immigrated from one country to another country. Um, and they have spent quite a few years in the host country. Now, their struggle can be described as having kind of a double consciousness. Why? Because if after a few years they move back to their homeland, they will not be accepted by their family members because from the viewpoint of their family members back in the homeland, they have changed. They have become like westernized, so to speak. Now they watch Hollywood movies if they have like migrated to the United States. They listen to foreign music, etc. And so this family itself cannot feel at home when they go back to their homeland anymore. But when they are in the host country, they cannot feel accepted either because they cannot assimilate easily into the culture of the host country because most probably the people in the host country do not accept them as first-rate citizens. So there's this kind of double consciousness of not knowing where you belong because you belong neither here nor there, a limbo state of between and betwixt. So Du Bois talks about this idea of double consciousness for African people, African American people, and African American artists. So some of them think of themselves as American, some of them think of themselves as African, as black, and they consider these two realms to be completely, oppositional. And so this double consciousness created a lot of debate in this period among African American community. And so there were some people who wanted to claim membership, wanted to be a member of the American culture at large or in general, but some people hated this and wanted to create a completely new artistic domain for themselves. Some of them wanted to, celebrate what was folksy about, African Americans, to celebrate African American culture, but some of them wanted to be intellectuals in an urban setting, and so that they could engage in conversations with white intellectuals. There were some who wanted to join like mainstream American culture, but there was also other people who said that mainstream American culture is full of prejudice, and so they kind of aligned themselves with revolutionary movements because they wanted to kind of rebel against this dominant American culture. So there was this kind of double consciousness between the members of the like Harlem Renaissance and this African American community, that some of them liked to be known as American artists, but some of them wanted to be known as black artists. And so for them, black was in opposition to American. We have so many examples to showcase this, like, for example, especially when it comes to the realm of women. So, this was even more visible in the realm of women. So, this fantastic novel by Nella Larsen, Passing, which was published in 1929, just talks about this issue of what was expected of women in African American households. And so, on the one hand, African American women wanted to do what African American men told them because they wanted to advance the cause of the black people. Because they knew that if they refused to do their duties, then they would be accused of being American and not caring about blacks or African Americans, right? Black people or African Americans. And at the same time, they were also thinking about themselves as individuals, and they were saying that all of these duties that they want me to perform, all of these duties are actually hurting my individual freedom. So again, there was this kind of double consciousness when it comes to African American women, and which is perfectly described in The Passing. So these are some of the issues which was happening to African Americans as well. But generally speaking, class inequality was a very important topic of the 1920s. And so it created again a lot of debates in this part. But as we get closer and closer to the 1930s, the role of economy is highlighted more and more and more. Now, a lot of people believe that this kind of probably capitalist mindset is not going to really help America because we still have class inequality, we still have class differences, we still have a lot of poor. And so they were looking, as I said previously, even the government was looking for models to combat this kind of inequality. And so a lot of people, were looking everywhere to see if they could find a solution for this. And so a lot of them were attracted to Karl Marx's ideas, which located the roots of all human problems in the realm of economy and in economics. Um, you know, uh, Marx was a very, very influential figure in this period. Obviously, we cannot really go into details because it requires a few separate sessions. But just very quickly, Marx actually believed that the society in general consists of two different classes: the capitalists who own factories, who gain a lot of profit, make a lot of money, and then the laborers who work in those factories. They are given a minimum amount of money, minimum wage, which is not really enough to have a sustainable life. And well, the society and the difference between them, the gap between them will never be filled. And so, kind of like the intellectuals in America who liked Marxist ideas, believe that this is very similar to, again, our concept of individualism, but in a different way. Now, they believe that capitalists were, those who had the power, those who had the money, were encouraging individualism. The idea of capitalism and consumerism that we talked about, that hey, you are free to do whatever you like in life. All of you are born in this at the same level, and then if you try really hard you can become rich. The American dream that was very popular in this age, the American dream that if you work really hard you can become rich or whatever. American intellectuals who liked Marxist ideas were arguing that this kind of individualism that in this period is very dominant in our culture is actually an argument that these capitalists like to propagate and like to propose, because for them, if there is individualism, every man is trying hard for only himself, and so they will not find some time to find solidarity and union, which was what Marxism was proposing. That one day all of the laborers, all of the workers will unite. They forget about their individual needs and they join forces to completely overthrow the capitalists and take control of the means of production of the factories. That's what communism is about, that the means of production and the factories are communally owned by everyone in the society, not just by a few rich people, which is what happens in a capitalistic society. So, in a capitalistic society, only a handful of people, a few people own all of the company, like Jeff Bezos, um, uh, from Amazon, has Amazon and is gaining billions in profit every year, while Amazon workers who work in the warehouse are given the bare minimum of money and they are required to work tirelessly, right? So it was a dream of Karl Marx that's one day a communist country would, survive in which everything was communally. That's where communism comes from. Everything is communally owned by people, by the laborers, by the workers. And so this idea of individualism versus society was really, really important in this age. Now, and in 1917, there was the communist revolution, of course, in the Soviet Union. Lenin led the revolution, and this kind of the USSR made a lot of Americans hopeful because they thought that, okay, well, this is a model that Marx really wanted. Let's see how it plays out. Let's see how people feel living in this kind of utopia, so to speak. I will come back to this idea of communism and how Americans felt later about it as we get closer and closer to the Second World War, and we will see what happens to this. Like, are Americans still hopeful at the beginning of the Second World War, or are they disillusioned? So we will come back to this later on. There were also other important things happening in the 1920s, which we have to talk about. Another, a very, very defining moment in the history of America is, of course, a trial which was held in the courts for two Italian guys, Sacco and Vanzetti. So they were Italian anarchists, but they did not believe in communism. And just remember the Red Scare that I talked about previously. The idea that there was this paranoia that everyone was a communist, and because America hated communism, everybody who was, accused of being communism was either deported or, kind of like prosecuted. So these Italians were anarchists, professed anarchists, but they were not communists. They did kill somebody. Okay, so there was a murder and there was a robbery, and then they went to trial in the court. But unfortunately, they did not get a fair trial. So they were sentenced to death, and they were finally executed. But the public knew that. Unfortunately, the trial was not fair because of their beliefs, because they were believed to be communists. And so their alleged beliefs in communism had a role in sentencing them to death. A lot of intellectuals protested in this era. John Dos Passos, Catherine Ann Porter, two very famous American writers, were protesting all the time to overturn this kind of death penalty and death sentence. A lot of poems and novels and even plays deal with this issue. So we have poems by William Carlos Williams, Edna Vincent Millay, Carl Sandburg. All of these influential poets, as well as novelists and dramatists, dealt with this issue because, again, it was related to the idea of freedom of belief, freedom of expression, as well as the Red Scare that we talked about. Another important case which happened in the courts was the Scottsboro case in the 1930s, of course. 9 black people were, indicted in Scottsboro, Alabama, for the alleged rape of 2 white women. And they were all found guilty. They were sentenced to death. The case went to the Supreme Court of the United States, which, of course, reversed the convictions because a second trial was given to them. And so in the second trial, Some of the witnesses recanted their testimonies. One of the women said that no, these people did not have any role in the rape. And so, even though the charges against five of them were dropped, the other four actually went to jail, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. And this idea of if you're a black person, you are not going to get a fair trial in the United States court system has since, and I'm using the present perfect tense here because it still exists in today's America. If you are a black person, you are not going to get a fair trial in the court system. This idea became a literary motif in the literature of the period. Just a few examples of this: Richard Wright's Native Son, which is an angry attack on how the white, kind of privileged society treats African Americans, was a very good example of this, using this literary motif. William Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust is another perfect example. And of course, last but not least, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, which I'm sure all of you know about. And so when I say that it's happening even today, I'm a true crime junkie. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and just I can give you just off the top of my head the name of so many podcasts which deal with, an African American man being accused of a crime he didn't commit, and then he went to jail for it. Like, just look up this podcast, In the Dark podcast, which is a, a harrowing account of an African American man called Curtis Flowers, who was accused of, murder, and then he was tried 6 times. He was tried in the court 6 times. Every time he was sentenced to like life in prison, and he was found guilty by a white jury, the case would go to an upper court, to even the Supreme Court. They would overturn the sentencing. But then the prosecutor, who was a white man, would start a new trial, and then again new white jury, and then they would again sentence him to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. So just look that up. It's a harrowing account of, a black man getting stuck in the court system in the United States, which of course began from this Scottsboro case. Now, I told you that, Americans were really, really hopeful when, let's just forget about this motive for a while. Let's just go back a few steps. I told you that, the communist revolution led by Lenin in 1917 left a lot of Americans hopeful that finally there was a model for dealing with inequality all over the world. And if they could adopt some of the ideas from communism, they could, deal with their problems as well. And so now, when we go to the 1930s, in the next part, we will talk about how this kind of ended, right? So I just wanted you to keep that in mind before moving forward. But before we get to 1930s, let's talk about another important thing that happened in this period, the role of science and technology. Now, technology played a very vital and essential role in connecting all parts of America and making America a modern nation. Because of technological advances in this period, we had new modes of production in factories, we had new modes of transportation, we had new modes of communication. Now people could have like phonograph records and record players. They could see motion pictures, they could listen to the radio. So America was changing a lot thanks to technology. But again, not everything was positive. There were critics as well. They were saying that, okay, well, technology has created a gap between those who are connected to technology and those who do not have access to this technology. So there's a new gap in our society, which is something not ideal. And also, they argued that, technology and television and radio is creating a passive population, a population which is content just sitting on a couch and then being fed information rather than working, So these were the two kinds of pieces of criticism that these critics had for technology. However, the most important technological invention and advancement in this period, of course, was something completely against passivity. It actually symbolizes activity, and that's the automobile. I talked about Henry Ford at the beginning of my presentation and argued that Henry Ford successfully changed automobile from a luxury item which could be owned by only a handful of people to a consumer good which could be bought by millions of people. And so it dramatically changed the American landscape. Why? Because we are not just talking about a car here, we are talking about infrastructure as well. So when you have a new transportation mode of transportation, you need to build everything for it, right? So when we had trains back in the day, they had to create railroads, right? And so a lot of workers were working on railroads. Now that we had cars, creating roads, creating highways was in demand, and so a lot of workers started working in these, places, in these companies which created and built roads and highways to connect all parts of America. And so millions of jobs were created, which were all related to automobile in the steel industry, in parts factories to create different parts for the cars, highway construction and maintenance, etc. And so there's a new symbol of America here. Now the railroad used to be a symbol. Now the road is itself a symbol. So much so that it continued even until 1960s and 1970s. And I'm not sure if you've heard of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, one of the beat writers who published On the Road, which kind of harks back to this time when the road became a symbol for the United States and modernity as well. And so because of all of these advances in technology, as well as advances in the realm of science, the atom was discovered, Einstein's theory of relativity was discovered, that again was something was as important as Freud's ideas, that everything is relative, nothing is perfect, nothing is a unified whole, everything is relative. And so if everything is relative, if everything is made up of different kinds of segments and fragments without really connecting them, without any connections between them, then how are we going to portray this in literature? And we will talk about this, that one of the defining features of the literature in modernism is actually this fragmentation of ideas, that ideas are not always coherently connected, right? So all of these changes, they created cities, the suburbs came into existence, small towns died, big cities came into existence, highways replaced the railroads. So all of these changes were happening in this period until we get to the 1930s, of course. And now we can talk about the 1930s. Now, as we said, the most important event which happened in 1929 was the stock market crash, and of course the Great Depression that ensued. Now, this Great Depression was not, again, something specific to the United States. It was a worldwide phenomenon which created a lot of social unrest all over the globe. And unfortunately, it led to a lot of fascist dictatorships in Europe. For example, General Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, and of course Adolf Hitler in Germany. So it was because of the Great Depression that these people could, establish their fascist regimes. Now Hitler's program, of course, and the rise of the, Germany led to, of course, the Second World War that we talked about previously. But this Great Depression had a lot of manifestations in the United States as well. A lot of people were arguing that, okay, only the poor people were influenced by this and rich people were not, but this is not the case. A lot of millionaires and bankers, yeah, they were millionaires, they were bankers, they were stockbrokers with a lot of money, but because they lost a lot of people committed suicide. But of course, many more people in the lower classes of society lost their jobs, their homes, and their farms. And I'm not saying that these two are in the same category, but just it's good for our perspective to know that like even rich people were influenced by the Great Depression. Something positive which happened during this time was the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States in 1932, and it was a victory for pragmatism in general, because he was a pragmatist. He believed in doing actual work to solve all of these problems. And so many of the liberal reforms that he introduced, like the social security programs to help poor people, creating jobs in the public sector, creating welfare programs, to take care of, the problems of the poor, and offering people unemployment insurance if they had lost their jobs because of the Great Depression. All of these actually kind of eased the effects of the Great Depression. So let's now go back to the idea of communism that we discussed earlier. Because economy was important in this age, as we said, a lot of people became members of the communist parties in the United States because they believed that, okay, well, communism can be a solution for us. There was also a journal called The Masses, later on became The New Masses, which became sort of like the literary voice of people, of literary figures who believed in communism. And so, as we said, initially people were enamored. They fell in love with the Soviet Union, right? The USSR. Even people who visited the country, they came back with glowing reviews of how wonderful life was in the Soviet Union. And so, something happened, of course, later on, which completely disillusioned all of these hopeful intellectuals and people. Well, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, of course, suddenly started a purge, killing lots of people who were kind of like descendants, and they had, different kinds of ideas, or they expressed different kinds of ideas that Stalin didn't like. And so all of this finally resulted in 1939. In fact, a lot of communists, let me just preface this next part by saying this, there's a lot of communists were actually against fascism. A lot of communists actually went to war against like General Franco in Spain. And they were hopeful, at least Americans were hopeful, that Russia would withstand the advances of Germany, and that the Soviet Union would actually help other countries defeat Hitler's Germany. But in 1939, Stalin signed a pact and promised not to go to war against Germany. This action completely disillusioned those people who were really hopeful that communism would, and the communist example of the Soviet Union would actually be a great model for solving the problems of the United States as well. Now that we have talked about the 1920s and the 1930s and most of the changes that occurred in this period, we can start talking about American modernism in general, and of course American modernism. But because I don't want this video to be too long and boring, I'm gonna stop this video right here, and we're gonna talk about the second part of our analysis of 1914 until 1945 in the second video, which is kind of more literary in nature, because I'm going to be talking about how modernism flourished, what kinds of tenets it had, and what kinds of rules and traditions they wanted to follow or maybe destroy. And then we will talk about the literary aspect of life in the first half of the 20th century in our second video. So thank you very much for watching the video here. Just be sure to check out the next video as well. And for now, it's goodbye.